Despite his decade-long rule over the Third Reich, Adolf Hitler could not have anticipated the ordeal awaiting him on the Eastern Front. The Russian winter was merciless, Soviet discipline unyielding, and partisan activity relentless. Every advance toward Moscow became a nightmare. Thousands of Nazi soldiers perished, not only from combat, but from starvation, freezing temperatures, and traps laid by civilians turned resistance fighters. Yet even these losses would pale in comparison to the fate that awaited captured SS troops. Every man and woman in the Soviet Union nursed a burning desire for vengeance, and they would seize any opportunity to exact it. When Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, he expected the Red Army to crumble swiftly. Unprepared and ill-equipped, the Soviets seemed vulnerable. But the alliance between Russia's harsh climate and an unyielding population proved more formidable than the Wehrmacht anticipated. By the end of 1941, the Soviets were battered and bloodied, yet far from defeated. The war between Germany and the Soviet Union was not a conventional conflict. It was a clash of survival, pride, and a fury that would not fade. In the early days, the German military relied heavily on the SS, elite troops whose brutality was unmatched. Hitler and Himmler trusted these men to carry out orders with ruthless efficiency. The SS Totenov division, among others, was notorious for fighting to the last man. Months of bloody engagement in southern Russia, including attempts to encircle the Soviet 16th Army near Demsk, highlighted the ferocity and tactical skill of these units. Even when surrounded, the SS clawed their way through, leaving trails of destruction and terror. Their commanders, decorated for bravery, believed themselves invincible. One such officer, SS Lieutenant Colonel Jim Piper, had earned a reputation that would haunt the Soviets for years. His battalion, dubbed the Blowtorch Battalion for its penchant for setting villages ablaze at night, terrorized civilians and enemy forces alike. Piper's cruelty extended beyond combat. In Belgium, he executed young German recruits for minor infractions, forcing their comrades to march past the bodies as a warning. By the time Normandy arrived, Piper had suffered a nervous breakdown, yet returned to the front lines for the Battle of the Bulge, where his men massacred over 100 American prisoners. Though tried and sentenced to life imprisonment, fate ultimately caught up with him decades later, ending his life in a fire, an act widely believed to have been carried out by former members of the French resistance. The atrocities committed by the SS only fueled the Soviet desire for revenge. Hitler had ordered the extermination of Slavic peoples and scorched earth tactics during retreats, leaving villages reduced to rubble and civilians slaughtered. Every destroyed town, every mass killing intensified the hatred in Soviet soldiers and civilians alike. Millions had suffered at the hands of the Nazis. The Soviet Union lost more than 27 million people, leaving the population determined to retaliate. Stalin's propaganda amplified this fury, framing the Germans as monstrous invaders, while civilians who had survived joined the war effort with a vengeance that knew no limits. As the war progressed, the Red Army implemented its own brutal measures. Destruction battalions, authorized to summarily execute any perceived enemy, followed frontline troops. These units burned villages, schools, and public buildings, leaving no stone unturned in their pursuit of retribution. Soviet secret police oversaw prisoners of war, forcing them to march for hundreds of miles under freezing conditions, with thousands executed along the way. Political prisoners captured before the war were not spared. Of the 90,000 German soldiers captured at Stalingrad, only 5,000 ever returned home. The rest perished, victims of both the harsh conditions and targeted vengeance. By the winter of 1942-33, the Eastern Front had become a crucible of fire and ice, where brutality and retribution were inseparable. SS soldiers, once feared as unstoppable, found themselves ensnared by the very violence they had inflicted on others. Each village they burned, each prisoner they executed, became a seed of revenge sown in the hearts of Soviet fighters. The front lines were no longer just battlefields, they were theaters of vengeance, where every action had consequences that would return to haunt the perpetrators. For Hitler, the Eastern Front had become a nightmare of his own making. His elite soldiers, trained to dominate and instill fear, now faced a relentless enemy fueled by decades of suffering and rage. The SS's reputation for invincibility crumbled under the weight of Soviet retaliation. What began as an invasion intended to crush the Red Army had transformed into a struggle for survival, a deadly dance where every act of German cruelty invited an equally vicious response. The Eastern Front was not merely a battlefield. It was a proving ground for vengeance, and the Germans would soon learn that the Soviets never forgot and they never forgave. By 1942, the tide on the Eastern Front had begun to shift. The Germans, who had expected a swift conquest, now found themselves facing a foe that refused to bend. The Red Army, though initially ill-equipped, had learned from each devastating encounter, and Soviet partisans struck relentlessly behind German lines. Villages, forests, and railways became hunting grounds for men and women determined to make the enemy pay for every loss, every atrocity committed in the name of the Third Reich. Hitler's SS units, elite and ruthless, believed themselves untouchable, but they were about to encounter the full force of Soviet vengeance. The Battle of Stalingrad marked a turning point. By February 1943, the Red Army had encircled the German Sixth Army, leaving tens of thousands of SS and Wehrmacht soldiers trapped in the frozen city. Hunger, frostbite, and relentless artillery fire devastated the German ranks. While some tried to escape or surrender, many met a harsher fate than death in battle. Captured SS soldiers would be subjected to Soviet retribution, a reckoning fueled by years of brutal occupation and murder in the territories Germany had conquered. The city itself became a symbol of Nazi overreach, a monument to the hubris of men who thought themselves invincible. It was not only Stalingrad that witnessed the bitter consequences of Nazi atrocities. Across the Eastern Front, the SS Panzer Corps, led by officers like Jim Piper, continued to employ scorched earth tactics, burning villages and executing civilians indiscriminately. Each act of cruelty carved deeper the path of revenge the Soviets were destined to follow. The soldiers of the Red Army were acutely aware of the reputations of these elite German units. Tales of Piper's blowtorch battalion spread among the Soviet ranks, fueling hatred and a singular focus: to punish, to survive, and to avenge. Yet the Soviets did not seek mere retaliation in isolation. Stalin's orders, combined with the anger of civilians, created a systematic method for vengeance. Destruction battalions moved behind frontline troops, burning farms, schools, and administrative buildings, leaving nothing for the enemy to claim. Captured SS soldiers and other German troops were forced to endure punishing marches across the icy plains, with many executed on the way. Reports from Ukraine and Belarus detail thousands being executed for attempting escape or simply as collective punishment, their fates sealed by the policies of revenge that had become standard practice by the Soviet command. The psychological impact on the SS was profound. Officers who had once inspired fear found themselves haunted by the knowledge that the Soviets were closing in, not just on the battlefield, but everywhere they had left destruction. Intelligence reports of the time reveal the growing dread among German units, who began to understand that no atrocity committed would go unanswered. Every village set ablaze, every civilian executed, every captured partisan killed became a debt that the Soviets were determined to collect. Even seasoned commanders could not shield their men from the consequences. SS Lieutenant Colonel Piper, notorious for his own brutality, began to realize that the unrelenting Soviet pursuit was not merely a military campaign, it was a personal reckoning. While German propaganda continued to depict Soviet forces as disorganized and ineffective, the reality on the ground was the opposite. Soviet troops combined tactical efficiency with a ferocity born of personal loss. Mothers, brothers, and sisters who had witnessed German atrocities now took part in the counteroffensives. Their hatred was precise, systematic, and lethal. By mid-1943, the Red Army had regained vast swaths of territory lost in the initial German invasion. The tide of revenge was visible in every engagement. SS units that had once thought themselves untouchable were systematically hunted, their supply lines destroyed, and their forces gradually whittled down. The Soviets had learned from the early defeats and now implemented strategies that combined conventional warfare with guerrilla tactics, ensuring that the SS could no longer operate with impunity. As winter approached once again, the Eastern Front was transformed. The Germans were no longer the hunters, they had become the hunted. The calculated vengeance of the Soviet soldiers and partisans created a climate of fear among the SS, who faced the reality that survival depended not on reputation or courage, but on evading an enemy driven by righteous fury. The psychological toll was immense. Reports from German officers describe sleepless nights, paranoid movements, and a growing sense of inevitability. By the end of 1943, the SS's reputation for invincibility had been irrevocably damaged. While the Germans had once seemed unstoppable, the Red Army's methodical, vengeful campaigns proved that no atrocity went unpunished. For every act of German savagery, the Soviets responded with equal ruthlessness, ensuring that each captured soldier would face consequences for crimes committed far from the battlefield. The Eastern Front had become a theater of vengeance, a place where human cruelty and resilience collided, leaving a legacy that would echo long after the war's conclusion. By 1944, the brutality of the Eastern Front had escalated to unimaginable levels. The SS Panzer Corps, once feared as the ultimate strike force of the Third Reich, had become a symbol of terror for both civilians and soldiers alike. Among them, the battalion led by SS Lieutenant Colonel Jim Piper had earned a particularly gruesome reputation. Piper's unit, infamous for their scorched earth tactics, would strike villages at night, setting homes aflame and leaving survivors in terror. The stories of his blowtorch battalion spread far and wide across the Soviet territories, a living nightmare that haunted every village, every farm, and every partisan outpost. The Soviets, however, were not merely waiting to be destroyed. They were preparing to repay each atrocity with an equal measure of fury. Red Army officers and local partisans meticulously documented German actions, identifying key units and commanders responsible for massacres and destruction. Every burned village, every executed civilian, every public humiliation became a target for retaliation. Piper's battalion, in particular, became a primary focus. Soviet intelligence circulated details of his past crimes, fueling a desire for vengeance that was both personal and collective. Piper's own arrogance blinded him to the dangers. He believed that his elite troops could overpower any Soviet resistance, and his cruelty was unmatched, even by SS standards. In Belgium, he had executed recruits for minor offenses. And during campaigns in Italy and the Eastern Front, he had shown no mercy to enemy combatants or civilians alike. But on the Eastern Front, the Red Army had transformed. Soldiers were no longer just fighting a foreign invader. They were avenging the destruction of their homes, the slaughter of their families, and the erasure of entire communities. Each encounter with German troops became an opportunity to repay these atrocities, and Piper's battalion, with its notorious record, was a prime target. The Soviet counteroffensives were relentless. Red Army units, combining conventional tactics with partisan guerrilla strategies, began to systematically track and ambush SS units. Supply lines were destroyed, villages were reclaimed, and any captured SS soldier faced immediate judgment. The harsh Russian winter, which had once been an obstacle for the Germans, now became an ally for the Soviets, amplifying the suffering of Piper's troops. Frostbite, starvation, and relentless attacks wore down even the most hardened soldiers. Prisoners captured by the Soviets were often executed or subjected to grueling marches in freezing conditions. Reports from the time describe thousands of SS soldiers and Wehrmacht men being forced to walk hundreds of miles under brutal conditions, with many killed along the way either for attempting escape or simply as collective punishment. The revenge was meticulous and calculated. It was not chaos, but an organized response to the systematic brutality that Germany had inflicted on Soviet lands. Even the elite officers were not immune. Piper, who had previously survived trials and life imprisonment for massacres of American POWs, now faced a different kind of justice. Soviet soldiers and partisans sought him not merely for military defeat, but for personal reckoning. Each ambush, each counterattack was designed to dismantle the aura of invincibility surrounding the SS Panzer Corps. The fear that Peiper had once instilled in others was now mirrored back upon him in full measure. As the Red Army advanced further into German-occupied territories, the cycle of revenge intensified. Villages once destroyed by Peiper's unit were now used as staging grounds for Soviet operations, with survivors and local partisans participating in the recapture of their homes. The Germans found themselves trapped between a relentless army and a population that remembered every atrocity. No retreat offered safety, no surrender guaranteed mercy. The SS, who had once believed themselves untouchable, faced a new reality. Every action they had taken in the name of the Reich had sown the seeds of their own destruction. By late 1944, the psychological impact on SS troops was as devastating as the physical one. Officers reported increasing paranoia, hesitation in combat, and a growing realization that the Soviets would not forgive or forget. Each engagement brought them closer to the consequences of their own brutality. Peiper's battalion, once a symbol of fear, became a hunted force, systematically targeted by Red Army units and partisan fighters. Their fame for savagery had ensured their downfall. The Eastern Front, already a theater of unimaginable horror, had become the ultimate stage for retribution. Peiper and his men were only a single example of the countless SS soldiers who faced relentless Soviet vengeance. For every atrocity committed by German forces, the Soviets responded with a combination of strategic precision, partisan guerrilla strategies, and deeply personal fury. By 1944, the cycle of violence had reached its peak, and the cost for the SS, both physical and psychological, was staggering. In the frozen forests, destroyed villages, and war-torn cities of the East, a message was clear: cruelty would not go unanswered. The SS had once held the power of life and death over civilians and prisoners alike. Now the Soviets wielded that same power in return, reshaping the battlefield into a crucible of vengeance that would leave an indelible mark on history. By the winter of 1944, the Eastern Front had become a frozen graveyard where brutality and vengeance intertwined. The Red Army, having reclaimed vast swaths of territory, was no longer fighting merely to defend their homeland. They were determined to exact retribution for every atrocity committed by the Germans. The SS, once feared as unstoppable elite forces, now faced a relentless opponent fueled not just by strategy, but by fury and personal loss. Every village they had burned, every civilian they had executed, became a spark for the fires of revenge that swept across the front. Stalin's scorched earth policies amplified this fury. Destruction battalions, operating in coordination with regular Red Army units, moved systematically through areas previously occupied by German forces. Their orders were clear: deny the enemy any resources, punish collaborators, and take justice into their own hands wherever necessary. Villages that had once been set ablaze by SS soldiers now became the stage for the Soviets' own retaliation. Farms, schools, and administrative buildings were burned, and anyone suspected of aiding the Germans faced immediate execution. The line between soldier and avenger had blurred, and the front lines were filled with men and women who remembered every loss, every murder, and every humiliation inflicted by the Nazis. Captured SS soldiers and other German troops suffered the full weight of this revenge. Prisoners were forced to march across freezing plains for hundreds of miles, often without sufficient clothing, food, or shelter. The marches themselves were deadly. Many succumbed to frostbite, starvation, or exhaustion. Thousands were executed along the way, either for attempting escape or as part of a systematic campaign of retribution. Political prisoners, civilians conscripted into labor, and even non-combatants who had aided German forces were not spared. In Ukraine and Belarus, tens of thousands were forced to evacuate under these brutal conditions, with official reports listing thousands executed or dying from the extreme circumstances. The Battle of Stalingrad had already set a precedent. Of the 90,000 German soldiers captured there, only 5,000 would ever return home. This staggering mortality rate sent a clear message to the SS and Wehrmacht. The Soviets did not merely fight to win battles, they fought to repay cruelty with cruelty. The captured soldiers were not victims of random violence. They were part of a calculated system of revenge, an unyielding response to the horrors inflicted on Soviet civilians. Every act of brutality committed by the Germans had been meticulously noted, and the Soviets ensured that justice, in their own terms, was served. Red Army commanders understood the strategic value of revenge. While mass executions and punishment marches were horrific, they also served as a warning to German troops still in the field. Intelligence gathered from prisoners and local populations was used to identify the most dangerous units, particularly those known for atrocities. SS divisions notorious for civilian massacres, like Piper's Panzer Corps, were systematically targeted. Supply lines were destroyed, villages were reclaimed, and every encounter with German forces became a potential act of retribution. The psychological effect on German soldiers was profound. SS officers who had once inspired terror now faced the stark reality that they were vulnerable. Paranoia spread, morale plummeted, and hesitation in combat became more frequent. The knowledge that any captured soldier could be subjected to summary execution or forced marches instilled fear in even the most seasoned troops. The SS's combination of military discipline and deeply personal vengeance created an environment where the SS's previous dominance was rendered meaningless. Civilian participation added another layer to the Soviets' retribution. Survivors of villages burned by the Germans joined partisan units, assisting in ambushes, sabotage, and intelligence gathering. Their knowledge of local terrain and the atrocities committed by the SS allowed the Soviets to inflict maximum damage on retreating or isolated units. In many cases, these civilians exacted personal revenge, targeting specific soldiers known to have committed murders or arson in their communities. By the end of 1944, the Eastern Front had become a crucible of vengeance. The SS, trained to strike fear into the hearts of their enemies, found themselves hunted, systematically dismantled, and terrorized. Each act of cruelty they had committed was mirrored back upon them with precision. The SS's approach was not indiscriminate violence, it was justice measured in fire, steel, and cold, reflecting the personal and collective rage of a nation that had suffered unspeakable losses. Every act of brutality committed by the Germans had been meticulously noted, and the Soviets ensured that justice, in their own terms, was served. Red Army commanders understood the strategic value of revenge. While mass executions and punishment marches were horrific, they also served as a warning to German troops still in the field. Intelligence gathered from prisoners and local populations was used to identify the most dangerous units, particularly those known for atrocities. SS divisions notorious for civilian massacres, like Piper's Panzer Corps, were systematically targeted. Supply lines were destroyed, villages were reclaimed, and every encounter with German forces became a potential act of retribution. The psychological effect on German soldiers was profound. SS officers who had once inspired terror now faced the stark reality that they were vulnerable. Paranoia spread, morale plummeted, and hesitation in combat became more frequent. The knowledge that any captured soldier could be subjected to summary execution or forced marches instilled fear in even the most seasoned troops. The Red Army's combination of military discipline and deeply personal vengeance created an environment where the SS's previous dominance was rendered meaningless. Civilian participation added another layer to the Soviets' retribution. Survivors of villages burned by the Germans joined partisan units, assisting in ambushes, sabotage, and intelligence gathering. Their knowledge of local terrain and the atrocities committed by the SS allowed the Soviets to inflict maximum damage on retreating or isolated units. In many cases, these civilians exacted personal revenge, targeting specific soldiers known to have committed murders or arson in their communities. By the end of 1944, the Eastern Front had become a crucible of vengeance. The SS, trained to strike fear into the hearts of their enemies, found themselves hunted, systematically dismantled, and terrorized. Each act of cruelty they had committed was mirrored back upon them with precision. The Red Army's approach was not indiscriminate violence, it was justice measured in fire, steel, and cold, reflecting the personal and collective rage of a nation that had suffered unspeakable losses. The bloodshed and retribution were not just physical, they were psychological weapons. The SS knew that their past actions would define their fates. Every battle, every village, every encounter was a reminder that vengeance had become an inseparable part of warfare on the Eastern Front. And as the Soviets pressed on, reclaiming territory and punishing perpetrators, the message was clear. Cruelty would never go unanswered, and no act of German terror would escape reckoning. The aftermath of Stalingrad left a scar not only on the German army, but on the psyche of every SS soldier who had survived. The once feared units, which had marched across Europe with ruthless precision, now faced a reality they could never have imagined. The Red Army, having witnessed the full extent of German brutality, no longer fought with mere strategy. They fought with a deep, personal vengeance that reached into every village, forest, and ruined town. Each encounter became more than a battle. It was a reckoning for every atrocity committed in the name of the Third Reich. SS soldiers who had escaped the encirclement were pursued relentlessly. Soviet intelligence meticulously tracked their movements, using local knowledge and partisan networks to predict their actions. Supply lines were sabotaged, retreat routes ambushed, and reinforcements intercepted. These were not random skirmishes. They were carefully planned strikes designed to punish and dismantle the elite units that had terrorized the Eastern Front. Every burned village, every executed civilian, and every forced march that the Germans had inflicted was repaid with unrelenting precision. The psychological warfare waged by the Soviets was as effective as their physical assaults. German soldiers were haunted by the knowledge that nowhere was safe, that every step could lead to an ambush, and that capture often meant death or suffering beyond imagination. The Red Army leveraged fear as a weapon, using propaganda to remind the SS of their crimes and to signal that no atrocity would go unpunished. Reports circulated about the brutal treatment of captured officers, including forced labor in freezing conditions, summary executions, and reprisals against the families of perpetrators. The message was clear: revenge was inevitable. Even the most hardened SS officers could not escape this reality. Lieutenant Colonel Yim Piper, whose battalion had once instilled terror across occupied territories, found himself under constant threat. Soviet units meticulously targeted his positions, cutting off supplies and exploiting weaknesses in German lines. Partisan fighters, many of whom had lost family members to Piper's scorched earth tactics, were relentless. They knew the terrain, understood the enemy's habits, and pursued vengeance with a precision born of personal loss. The psychological toll on Piper and his men was immense. Every encounter brought reminders of the chaos they had sown and the inevitability of Soviet retribution. Captured SS soldiers often became unwilling instruments in this psychological warfare. They were forced to witness the destruction of their own units and the suffering of comrades while enduring harsh marches and brutal treatment. Thousands were executed along the way, either for attempting escape or as a deliberate act of punishment. The Soviets understood that the most effective revenge was not only physical, but mental, instilling fear, guilt, and despair in those who had once wielded power over life and death. The Red Army's methodical approach extended beyond immediate retribution. Villages and towns destroyed by the Germans were reclaimed and fortified. Local populations, many of whom had endured unimaginable suffering, participated in the defense and surveillance of these territories, ensuring that German forces could not easily re-establish control. Survivors of massacres joined partisan groups, providing intelligence and assisting in the capture of enemy soldiers. Every victory became a personal act of vengeance, each Soviet advance a response to decades of oppression and murder. By late 1944, the Eastern Front had become a theater dominated by retribution. The SS, which had once held the upper hand through terror and brutality, was now systematically hunted. Units that had instilled fear in civilians and enemy soldiers alike were dismantled piece by piece. Supply lines were sabotaged, communications disrupted, and isolated groups were annihilated or captured. The SS's combination of conventional warfare, partisan tactics, and psychological operations ensured that the legacy of SS atrocities would return to haunt those responsible. The cycle of vengeance had reached its peak. German soldiers were no longer aggressors in the traditional sense, they were prey. Every step they took, every position they held was under constant scrutiny, and every misdeed committed during their advance across Soviet lands became a debt to be repaid. The Eastern Front had become a crucible where cruelty and justice collided, and the SS were learning that no reputation, no medal, no fearsome reputation could shield them from the consequences of their own actions. As the Soviets pressed forward, reclaiming lost territories and punishing perpetrators, it became evident that the war was not only a fight for land, but a reckoning for human cruelty. The SS's past atrocities had sown the seeds of their downfall, and the Red Army's vengeance ensured that those seeds would bear a bitter harvest. In this frozen and bloodied landscape, justice and revenge became inseparable, and the survivors of the Eastern Front would remember with every step and every bullet that cruelty would never go unanswered. By early 1945, the Eastern Front had become the ultimate stage for vengeance. The once mighty SS, whose name had struck fear across Europe, now faced the full measure of Soviet retribution. The relentless advance of the Red Army, coupled with the tireless efforts of partisans and surviving civilians, left little refuge for those who had once wielded terror so freely. Every atrocity committed by the SS in prior years was now repaid with methodical precision, and the consequences were inescapable. Captured SS soldiers faced grim fates. Prisoner of war camps, though officially under Soviet regulation, often became arenas for revenge. The marches to these camps were treacherous. Thousands were forced to traverse freezing plains for hundreds of miles without adequate clothing, food, or shelter. Starvation, frostbite, and exhaustion claimed countless lives before the prisoners ever reached their destination. Those who resisted or attempted escape were executed on the spot. The Soviets viewed these measures not as violations of international law, but as acts of justice for the millions of lives lost to German atrocities. The numbers are staggering. Of the 90,000 Germans captured at Stalingrad alone, only 5,000 survived to return home. Many of the others perished due to the harsh marches, executions, or the brutal conditions in Soviet labor camps. Political prisoners, former collaborators, and those accused of aiding the Nazis met similar fates. The scale of retribution was immense, reflecting the depth of anger and grief that had accumulated over years of occupation, massacre, and destruction. Yet the vengeance was not only physical, it was psychological. German soldiers and officers who survived battles or marches were haunted by the knowledge of what awaited them. Each captured comrade, each village reclaimed, each destroyed unit served as a reminder that cruelty begets cruelty. The Soviets' approach was deliberate. It ensured that the horrors inflicted by the SS would be mirrored back upon them, creating a cycle of terror that eroded morale and shattered the illusion of invincibility. The hunt for notorious officers like Yim Piper intensified. Piper, whose Panzer Corps had left a trail of burning villages and massacred civilians, became a symbol of the kind of SS officers the Soviets were determined to hold accountable. Though many of these men initially escaped immediate capture, Soviet forces pursued them relentlessly, often relying on intelligence from local partisans who remembered every act of atrocity. Ambushes, targeted strikes, and coordinated operations left little room for evasion. Even elite SS troops trained to strike fear and dominate battlefields were not immune to the consequences of their own cruelty. The Red Army's campaigns in late 1944 and early 1945 were marked by a unique combination of strategy and personal vengeance. Each engagement was informed by prior atrocities, ensuring that SS soldiers faced not only superior numbers but also a deep-seated desire for revenge. The soldiers and officers of the Red Army were acutely aware of what had been done to their families, communities, and homeland, and they carried that memory into every battle. The Eastern Front had become more than a military campaign. It was a reckoning for the crimes committed by the Third Reich. Even the civilians who had endured the worst of the SS's brutality played a role in the final stages of the war. Survivors of burned villages and massacred families joined partisan groups, providing intelligence, guiding Soviet troops, and in many cases participating directly in operations against remaining German units. Their involvement ensured that the pursuit of justice was both personal and collective, and it added an additional layer of inevitability to the SS's downfall. By the time Berlin fell and the Third Reich collapsed, the legacy of the Eastern Front was clear. The SS, once celebrated for their brutality and feared across Europe, had been systematically dismantled, hunted, and repaid in kind. The prisoners who survived did so at staggering cost, and the thousands who perished became symbols of a vengeance that the Soviets deemed necessary for the survival of their nation. The human cost was immense, but it reflected the depth of suffering inflicted upon the Soviet Union over the previous 4 years. The Eastern Front had become a theater where justice and vengeance were inescapable. German cruelty had sown the seeds of its own destruction, and the Soviets had harvested them with precision and relentless determination. For every atrocity committed, there was a reckoning. For every burned village, every slaughtered family, every SS soldier who had thought themselves untouchable, there was a consequence. In this frozen, bloodied landscape, the message was unmistakable. Cruelty begets cruelty, and the price of terror is always paid in full. In the end, the fate of the SS on the Eastern Front serves as a chilling reminder. While battles may be won or lost, the consequences of brutality endure. The Soviets, fueled by righteous fury and personal loss, ensured that the acts of terror committed by Hitler's elite forces would never be forgotten or forgiven. The Eastern Front was not merely a battlefield. It was a stage for human vengeance, where justice and retribution collided in a deadly, unforgettable crescendo.